The aim of this video is to show some weathering techniques which don't rely upon an airbrush. I'm mainly going to be using acrylic paints. In the first case, to achieve the fade or colour transition, I'll be using a set of cheap craft acrylics. As you can see, I only paid about £8 for this set, and various other types of craft acrylics are available. Check your local craft store. The main part of the demonstration will be how to change that factory fresh paint finish into something which looks like it's been outside in the weather for a number of years. Any railway vehicle which has been exposed to the sunlight will mean that the ultraviolet light will degrade the paint colour, usually to a lighter tone, sometimes darker but usually lighter. The method here is known as the acrylic fade, which has been brought into prominence by an American weatherer by the name of Gary Christensen. He uses it extremely effectively, and its popularity has caught on as a result of him developing this method. A lot of people try to recreate the fade just by spray brushing a lighter colour over the top of the base colour that it comes out the factory from. Now here's a car that I tried to do exactly that with, but when you look at it you can see that it actually has the appearance of a frosting, i.e. the same sort of look that you get when your motor car's been parked on the driveway overnight when it's been frosty. The faded colour seems to sit on the outside of the paint rather than actually being part of the paint. So to get this faded acrylic paint to stick to your model, you're first going to have to provide a base coat to give it some sort of key. My preferred method is to use an airbrush with an acrylic matte varnish, but you can obviously use a spray can of matte varnish. In this case I'm using some Tester's dull coat. I'm sure you could also try and thin down some acrylic varnish and brush it on in multiple layers to give you that finish. I've not tried that myself yet, but I'm sure it would work. So to get the acrylic paint ready for going onto the model, first you need to mix it to the right shade, and here I'm using a buff yellow mixed with a bit of white to give the shade that I want, and then you need to thin it down with some water, just plain tap water. It needs to be relatively thin. I have to be a bit careful here because if you go too thin the watery paint will not stick to the model at all, and if you go too thick it'll start to obscure the details. So there's a happy medium somewhere in between. You just need to experiment. So brush the paint on carefully, and as you can see I'm using vertical strokes here as the final strokes, because if you do get any streaking on the model you want it to be in the correct direction. This would replicate rainwater running off the top of the freight car in a vertical downward direction. If you try and use horizontal brush strokes then the look would not be right. As you can see there is an accumulation of excess paint around some of the raised details. You just use your paintbrush as a mop, take the excess paint off and mop it off onto a paper towel and go around until you've got most of it off. To speed up the drying process I'm just using a small hairdryer. I'm sure you could use a fan heater, etc. This is particularly useful if you're trying to build the coats up in various layers. It saves you having to wait around between layers to get them air dried. Once the fade coat is dried you need to look again to your photograph and you'll notice that the colouring didn't extend over the logo or any of the numbers, so you need to remove the fade coat from those letters and numbers, and the way you do that is just using a small toothpick moistened in water, and you go around and take it off. Because the letters and the numbers tend to be of a glossy paint which is factory applied, it allows the paint on the top to lift off quite easily. Then once you've got to the point where you're satisfied, that's the time to apply another coat of dull varnish to seal all that first coat in. I'm going to skip that on this particular model here. I'm going to go straight into putting some rust on just to demonstrate how that works. I'm using the MIG ammo set of rust coloured paints. In this particular case I'm using the second to darkest brown, and just using that prototype image as a guide, applying the rust on in a pattern which looks fairly realistic. I'm not going to try and slavishly replicate every single rust dot here, but just the general feel of it is going to be enough for me on this particular occasion. So to add a wee bit more detail to the rust that we've just put on, we can add some streaks. Now there are various liquids you can use, such as ammo streaking fluids. You could also use acrylic paint thinned down, but this is an easy technique I've discovered, which is by using some weathering powder and one of these very soft silicone makeup brushes, which are available very cheaply on eBay. And it's just simply a case of shaking up the container of your weathering powder. You want a little bit to stick on the lid, but not a lot, so you tap most of it off, and then using a wooden straight edge to give you a guide, you can then drag your brush down and leave a few streaks. The bleeding effect that comes out of rust, also known as haloing, again, you can use liquids to apply that sort of effect, but it's also just as easy to use the powders. Once all of this has been done, you really must seal this lot in now with a coat of matte varnish of your choice to protect particularly the powders, but also to protect the acrylic paint you've put on. Okay, once we've got everything finished, I've gone outside here now and taken a couple of photos of this model in the sunlight, just using a small diorama that I built for the purposes of it. Taking the pictures in sunlight gives you a true indication of what it really looks like. And as you can see, the fade looks pretty good. And looking at the other models in the picture as well, it shows you that by varying the colours on the fade, you can achieve a non-uniform appearance to your rake of rolling stock. I'd really encourage you to give this method a go. It's certainly a very effective way of achieving the fade without ending up with that frosted look. And of course, I've only demonstrated this on something yellow. Clearly other colours are available, as they say. The most common colour being the red oxide for most, even American freight cars, and certainly for the British goods wagons. You can mix up a pale batch of the oxide colour, greens, blues, etc. I hope you've found some use for this video. I'm going to be attempting another video which shows also trying to achieve a fade, but this time using artist oil paints, and we'll get into that shortly.